Reverend Abby Cato is a native of Winston-Salem who currently resides in Yadkin County on a 20-acre farm with her husband, DC, 2 Australian shepherds, and 4 horses. She has 2 grown daughters and 3 teenage grandchildren she loves dearly. But life has not always been so good. After leaving a traumatic marriage of 10 years, I think 10 years is a long time, she decided to pursue a secondary education. She obtained her Bachelor of Science in Psychology from High Point University, graduating magna cum laude in 3.5 years. In 2006, she obtained her K-12 Exceptional Children's Teaching Certification from Salem College. After teaching for a few years, her health necessitated resignation from teaching high school. Upon returning to good health, she was guided toward applying for her Master's of Divinity at Wake Forest University School of Divinity. She completed the program in 2017 and was then ordained as a minister with a Christian church. That's Disciples of Christ. All of this was accomplished while owning and managing a landscape business. Can you imagine? And she's managing employees, making sales calls, and doing everything to run that business while she's going to school, making fabulous grades, building this awesome network. It just blows my mind. While in seminary, Reverend Cato met someone who proposed the idea of building a home for women who had survived trauma, where they could live and heal from the effects of the trauma they had experienced. Abby was led to take this on as her ministry upon graduating and began working on the development of her nonprofit, Annie's Hope Center for Growing and Healing, which you will learn more about from her presentation. Please help me in welcoming Reverend Abby Cato.
Thank you all. I don't really think I need the mic. This has pretty good acoustics in here. But I really appreciate all of you coming this evening, and I would like to start my presentation with a song that I wrote many years ago that kind of describes some of what I went through living in a home where I was subjected to domestic violence. He comes home from a hard day's work. She's got supper on the stove. He walks by, doesn't say a word. Hurts her, but she just lets it go. He sits down to watch the evening news, followed by the two familiar sounds of him kicking off the shoes. And she wonders why she'd be around. But where would she go, and what would she do? There's no one to trust, no one Thank you. So I just want to give you a little bit more depth about what that song is about. Growing up here in Winston-Salem, I was in a family of 6 children, and my father was a very abusive alcoholic who not only abused my mother many times in front of us kids, but also abused all of us children physically. Never sexually abused me. I don't know about any of my other siblings. They've never said anything about that. But there was many a night that my father would come home in a drunken rage and yank us out of bed and find some reason to beat us or beat my mother. And we would have to leave on many occasions if we could get away. My father went to prison, went to jail, went to prison many times because of the assault on a female. And my mother would take us all and uproot us and move us to another place trying to, run away from my dad, but he always found us somehow or another. So that was kind of the way my life was until my mother finally decided, for whatever reason, to leave my father, and I was 15 at the time. I had already, my older sisters, I have 2 older sisters, they had left home at very young ages because of our horrible situation at home. I left home and lived on the streets many times as a teenager, and did things that today I'm not proud of. But as Anna was talking about, girls who live in traumatic situations do terrible things because they don't have any self-esteem. They really, feel like they're worthless. And so it's just this search for trying to find some value in who you are, and if somebody shows any affection to you, you jump right on it. So the last time that I remember an exchange between my parents was my mom driving down our road and firing a gun at my dad, with me sitting on the porch right beside him. And obviously she missed. She didn't hit either of us, thank goodness. I don't know how she would live with that. But so she finally got away, and then I finally left for good when I was 16. And from my father. I lived in a house with my dad with no power, no water. I was trying to go to school, and I didn't have what most people have, and I couldn't get up and take a shower in the mornings, couldn't brush my teeth because we had no water. And so it was a real struggle. And so I finally went to live with my mom and her boyfriend, who was also abusive to her and to all of us. And so it's just, a pattern that continued throughout my early years. Well, I ended up living with my mom and stepdad next door to some guys, and I had decided just to have a place to live and get away from all of that, to go into the Marine Corps. I enlisted in the Marines when I was 17. Actually, I was before I was 17, but I couldn't actually go into the service until I turned 17. And both my parents had to sign for me to go into the service, and they did. And so when the time came, after I turned 17 in September, I was supposed to leave for basic training in January, the next January. And one of the guys living next door, who I'd been dating at 16, he was 21, said, well, we're going to go out on our last date. And we went out on our last date, and we just had been having fun. He had not been violent, shown any signs of violence. And he took me to this motel in Mount Airy and wouldn't bring me home. He said, you're not leaving. I'm not letting you leave. Well, I didn't think anything about that. I'm like, okay, fine. I just need a place to live. And so I ended up moving in with him and his mother. That went over real well. She didn't think a whole lot of me. But, and then I ended up pregnant. And so at 18, like 2 days after I turned 18, we got married. And he had already started hitting me by then, and abused me several times while I was pregnant. I lost my first child. Nobody knows why. But the abuse continued and continued. And it was, there were guns in the house. He would shoot at me. He would play Russian roulette with me with his guns. He had quite a collection of guns. He was an alcoholic, really bad alcoholic. And so when my other children were born, he wasn't abusive to them, wasn't mean to them at all. He was a very good father, basically. And so I thought, even though he was still abusing me, that I was doing my kids, a better service by staying with him because he wasn't hurting them. And it wasn't until my kids were 6 and 8, and something really had set him off that day. I don't remember exactly what happened, but he got really violent, threw all the food that I had cooked for dinner, just smashed it on the floor, and hit me several times, threw me into the stove. And then he proceeded to tell my daughters standing there how worthless I was, and that this is what happens to women who don't listen to their men, or something to that effect, and stripped my clothes off and raped me in front of my children. And was telling my daughters, this is how bad women are treated. Well, that did it. I said, that's it. I can't stay here anymore. And so I finally left and had people helping me, got away. He stalked me for quite a while after that. But I never even considered going back. Once I was done, I was done. And so I couldn't deny my kids from seeing him. And again, he wasn't ever mean to my kids. My kids loved him. And they, still to this day, hate that he did what he did to me. But he was not horrible in the sense that he wasn't a good role model. He was not good. He got into drugs pretty bad and ended up dying several years ago. But I, even after leaving him and having gone through what I went through, I got back into another abusive relationship. But again, just didn't leave. I just thought, I'm not leaving. I'm going to stand my ground, and I'm not leaving. And the day came when I finally did decide that enough was enough, and I got away from that relationship. And what goes on through your mind many years, even today, I'm almost 60 years old, and even today, I battle with feeling worthy of anybody's love and affection and kindness. So it really does a number on you psychologically and emotionally. So when I started divinity school and was trying to figure out what it is I'm supposed to be doing, because I tried all these other things when I went to school for psychology. I thought I was going to do this. And then when I started teaching, I thought, okay, well, I'm going to do this, because I really wanted to help people who were struggling with some kind of terrible issue. I wanted to work with kids with behavioral issues. And so when I started divinity school, I really thought I was going to go live in a country in South America and do Peace Corps, seniors Peace Corps work, helping people grow food. And I heard a sermon about, serving God in your own backyard, and I thought, okay. I had talked to this woman who told me about her dream of building this house for women survivors of trauma. She had been through a horrible, all rapes are horrible, but she had been through a very traumatic rape and had severe PTSD from it. And she wanted to build this place for women. And so I said, okay, that sounds like a great idea. Why don't we do that on my farm? And I was just going to help her. But then she ended up moving back to Asheville. And it was a couple months later that I heard that sermon about serving in your own backyard. And I was like, well, maybe that's what I'm supposed to do. Maybe that was, God's message message to me to do this. And I had the land, I certainly had the experience of having gone through what I went through, and had psychology training, and all these things just came together, and it seemed like the perfect thing. And I'm like, okay, I can do this. And so I started working on developing Annie's Hope. So I want to show you the slideshow more about Annie's Hope.
If you just run your finger over the finger pad.
Yeah, I
It'll
have
read everything
a
out.
remote somewhere. Aha! Here it is. Okay, so I have cheat notes here. Get it on. There we go. All right. So, Annie's Hope Center for Growing and Healing is the name of the nonprofit that I started in 2017, right after my graduation from divinity school. And it is being built on my farm that Anna mentioned out in East Bend. And I know that most of you in here know what domestic violence is. And just to give you the definition of domestic violence, which is also called intimate partner violence, is a pattern of behaviors. It's not just one thing, it's a pattern of behaviors by one partner to maintain power and control over another partner in an intimate relationship. Domestic violence does not discriminate. It crosses all lines of race, gender, economic status. Doesn't matter. All types of people engage in domestic violence. And they're behaviors that harm either psychologically or physically or mentally, socially, another person. And I know that many of you in here are familiar with the wheel of domestic violence. One of the panelists who was here not too long ago when we did that panel discussion on domestic violence, Julie Owens, she had a post on Facebook recently about saying, let's not call it the cycle of violence, because it's really not a cycle. It continues all the time. There's no cycle to it. And this is what violence looks like, domestic violence. All these things: coercion, intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation. When I was living with my first husband, he would not allow me, and my best friend sitting right here can vouch for this, he wouldn't allow me to see and talk to her. He wouldn't allow me to see and talk to my family. I was cut off from everybody. And it's power, it's control. Children, using children, and again, that's what he would do. He would say to my kids, your mother's worthless. Look how awful she is. And of course we know about male privilege and economic abuse. I had no money. My first husband would have all these fancy cars that he loved to own, and I drove around in a beat-up truck with holes in the truck. It had been shot up, holes in the floorboard. That's what I carted my kids around in. So how prevalent is domestic violence in the United States? 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner. And so we've been here almost an hour. So 60 times 20, how many is that? 1,200? Does that sound right? Yes. 1,200 people in the United States, since we've been sitting in here, have been abused in some way, shape, or form. That's how prevalent it is. And so that equates to more than 10 million women and men. It's not just women. Men are abused as well. I've seen it happen. It's 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men. And that is over the course of their lifetime. Severe physical violence, stalking. On a typical day, there are more than 20,000 phone calls placed to domestic violence centers. Accounts for 15% of all violent crime. 15%. That's a very high number. When you think about robberies, stabbings, carjackings, kidnappings, murders, go on and on. But 15% is because of intimate partner violence. And what do you think the most prevalent ages are for women to be involved in a domestic violence situation, intimate partner violence? What do you think are the most critical ages for that?
20 to 40.
18 to 24. Yes. And again, that was my situation. And when women or men are victims of violence and sustain really bad physical injuries, only 34% of those with physical injuries seek medical care. Why is that? The stigma, the fear, yes, fear, shame. Fear not only of what people will think, but fear of repercussion from their partner. One of the incidents that I will never, ever, ever forget as long as I live was with my dad when I was about 14 or 15. It was right before I left. And I had gone out and, I don't know what, I guess I did something wrong. I'm sure I did something wrong. I was always doing things wrong. And I came home and he hit me. So he asked me a question and I told him my answer and he said, "You're lying." And I said, "No, I'm not." And he hit me with his fist so hard that it knocked me against the wall across the room. And I screamed and my neighbor called the police and the police came to the door. And I went to the door and my chin was bleeding and had a big knot in my chin. And my dad was standing behind the door and he said, "If you tell them I hit you, I'll kill you." And I believed him. So I told him I fell in the bathtub. That's what happens. North Carolina's statistics are such that this was in 2016, so 3 years ago, 10 million, in 2016 there were 10,042,082 residents in North Carolina that made 102,000 calls to service providers, and about half of those 102,000 became clients to the centers where they call. White females represented 28 to 40. White females aged 28 to 40 are the largest group who call into the centers for help. 3,100 referrals to shelters outside the county where the women live, but due to lack of space. And anybody involved with domestic violence shelters can tell you we need more and more and more. 2 people a week died from domestic violence in 2013. 1,678 victims served in a single day, in one day, in 2014.
Is that in here?
In North Carolina. In North Carolina. In one day. 860 domestic violence victims found refuge in emergency shelters. In a 24-hour period in 2014, 637 calls were answered. And I think Susan had mentioned that you had served with family services as a crisis call. Yeah, and I do that now, and it brings off the hook. People needing help. It's awful.
And there's all no women.
Yes, that's the case all the time. At any of the shelters.
When I was working at a shelter in Burnsville, it was just horrible. I would just constantly praying to God because it was like I would call
questions that women get asked all the time. Why don't they just leave? If you have never been in a domestic violence situation, and you probably ask yourself this too, when you hear of a woman going through, or a man going through this, why don't they just pack up and leave? It's just not that simple. There are things to think about, like what's going to happen to the kids if you leave. Where are you going to go? There's nowhere to go. Your your violent partner has alienated you from all your friends and family, and they're afraid, and you're afraid that if you went there, they're going to come after you, and they're going to get hurt. And in fact, that's what often happens, is a lot of the injuries and homicides that happen with domestic violence, it's not the victim, it's family members and police officers who respond to the calls. It is like the number one of the lady working at Family Services now is was working for the Davie County Sheriff's Department. And I met with her today for lunch, and she was telling me about, in a given day, the number of women she saw, the number of autopsies that she had to go to, the number of children she saw dead, and that's why she had to stop, because it just is too much. But, you know, they have the control of the money. There's nowhere to go. They don't have a job. They don't have education. There's many, many reasons. And Susan well knows that the minute they try to leave is the worst time ever, because the main thing is that power and control, and they don't want to lose it. So they're going to do everything they can to keep you under their control, even if it means killing you. And then, of course, there's what we talked about, societal barriers. Have you ever been in a situation where you've seen someone having a fight, a man and a woman having a fight? Have you ever witnessed that in public? What do you do? What do you do? Do you go and try to intercede? I have done that.
I did it one time and I found myself in trouble.
Yes. So people think they're not going to help me. And people are scared. No, I don't want you to come here because I'm afraid they're going to come after me. And it does happen. So you can understand why women stay in their relationship. They don't want to endanger someone else. They don't want to endanger their children. They want their kids to have a father or a mother, if that's the case. And a lot of times they're not believed by law enforcement officers. Women have gone to jail when they're the victim because the man will say, I've seen this on TV, where the man will say, oh, but she scratched me, you know, when she was defending herself, and she ends up going to jail. So what is our society doing to discourage people from leaving? And that's something that we need to work on and educate people about. I mentioned that I went to church every Sunday in my song, and I did. And the church I went to told me not to leave. The church that I belong to, and I'm not going to name the church, but they said, oh no, when you marry, it's for life. And you are subject to your husband, no matter how bad he is. He's your husband, and he's your head, and you listen to him. I was told to just cower down and not fight back, not to run away, not to say anything, just to take it. That's what I did until that night. So there are lots of things, lots of reasons why people stay. And then they end up losing their lives. I'm not going to go to the website, but it's a pretty long URL. But what it is, it's a link to a list of all the shelters and resources in North Carolina.
And there are a lot of resources, there's just not enough because of the prevalence. So, being that there is such a lack of help and resources for women, especially in situations of domestic violence, the reasons, we've talked about the reasons they don't leave. Annie's Hope was conceived to help women who make the decision to leave and have nowhere to go, but don't have the resources to, and the shelters here, the shelter here in Winston-Salem is a great shelter. It's a very temporary place to go. Most women don't stay very long for various reasons.
And I went twice, and I stayed for a few weeks each time. That's why I like the stability of having the long-term stay, because I went right back into it. I mean, the honeymoon stage, I'll be different and all that.
Yeah.
So I like it, because it's their main goal is to get you out, but you're not ready mentally,
No.
because you've had years of conditioning.
Yes.
And so I love that of it, at least 6 months to a year
Yes.
to be able to get back on your feet.
Yes, and Annie's Hope is different in the sense that it is not an overnight emergency shelter. It is for women who have been at an overnight emergency shelter for several weeks and say, I am not going back. I am not going back. But they have nowhere else to go. And so this will be for a long term. And women who choose to come and stay at this home will be required to sign a commitment to stay at least a year, if not 18 months. Because it takes a lot of undoing all of that mental stuff that's been put into your head.
A lot of times women, and myself and my sister included, you couldn't even look someone in the eye for a long time, because you had to have, they were always just condemning you constantly.
Yes,
So I'm just so happy. I'm so excited.
yes.
So this is amazing.
I still struggle with that.
Sure.
And it's not just they'll come and they will have options if they have a job, but we know, because of what I'm getting ready to talk about in a minute, Allison's Law, that the perpetrators will come to your place of work. Women, lots of women I know, have lost their jobs because the guy comes to their place of work and harasses them, and their boss, you can understand why they would say, you can't work here anymore. And everywhere they go, they get found. So Annie's Hope will be a place where they will have the capability to earn money while they're living there by doing things, the social enterprise work that will go on there, like the gardening. This is a photo of my farm, and look at those sparkles. Isn't that cool? You see the sparkles?
Yes.
Yeah. Look,
Fireflies.
isn't that cool? It does sparkle like that. But this is the farm, and this is the road that the house it won't be sitting on the road, but this is a vision. This looks like a vision of a house I had when I went on a visioning quest with some people at a retreat, and I saw a house like this. And it was like, oh my goodness, this is so real. And so I immediately started looking for a house that looked like this, and this is the one I found. And this is, you can see the drawing here, this is the house that we're building. And for whatever reason, I think the reason was, in my vision, it was because this house reminded me of a house that you would play in as a child, a little girl. So it's kind of like going back to your childhood and starting over, where you're safe and where you're away from harm.
So here is where the house is so far. The board and I started raising funds last year in July. So we haven't even been fundraising for a year. And the money that we've raised thus far has been spent on getting the footings and the foundation. This was just done a couple weeks ago. And so I'm now at the point where I need sponsorship for the framing. That's the next stage. So the women who come to live at Annie's Hope will learn how to grow food, because you saw the farm. I've made plenty of room for growing produce, and to sell to local restaurants and at farmers markets. We will also have bees, and so we'll have honey production. So we'll sell honey and make soaps and lotions and different body products from the herbs that we grow on the property. And this, to me, is one of the most beautiful things about the vision of Annie's Hope, is that working in the dirt gives you a sense of peace like nothing else. And it really helps you to form a connection to yourself and to God. And I think that's why I've worked in the dirt my whole life. I grew up, in the summers I would go to Stokes County and stay with my grandparents, and I grew up working in tobacco fields. And so I've had my hands in the dirt all my life. So Annie, the name Annie, was my mother's name. And one day, sitting in class after that young woman, that friend of mine, who entertained the idea to me about this house, this home, I was sitting in class and I was like, well, what am I going to call it? And it just came to me, Annie's Hope. My mom, as you can see, died in 2012. She was 80, and she had suffered from Alzheimer's from the time she was 64. And I never got a chance to ask her, why didn't you leave? But I'm sure I know what her answer would have been. The same thing that I sang about. Where would she have gone? With 6 children? The state, I'll never forget, the state came and tried to take us away one time. And all of us kids, we're all really close. My brothers, my sisters, well, my brothers passed away, but my sisters and I are all really close. And, we just formed those bonds because we had to survive. And the state tried to take us away, because they should have, but we ran when they came. We're like, no, you're not. So even kids stay with abusive parents and caretakers, because it's like that's the only love you're getting, and some is better than none, I guess. So as Anna mentioned, did we talk about the legislative pieces?
No, I forgot. If I was going to bring it up at the end of your talk, Robin's got 3 key pieces.
Okay, well, I'll let you bring those up. But, people are starting to slowly but surely, people are starting to understand. I have gone and spoken in a couple of churches about the way that the church has really, maybe not intentionally, but the church has really been, what is the word I'm looking for?
Enabling?
Yes, enabling.
Complicit.
Complicit in violence against women because of this ancient teaching of women being in subjection to men. And that, you're supposed to just bow down to a man and do whatever they say because he's the man. And that's just wrong. We think about, women losing their power because of that and staying in situations because of that. So I would really like to, as a pastor, talk about that in any place I can, how we need to really work against that in the church, what they're teaching in
So,
churches.
so you're welcoming other speaking engagements, is what you're saying?
Yes, if,
You want to be a spokesperson?
yes. Well, I went to Cuba back in October of last year and talked to women about violence there. And it happens a lot there, as it does anywhere else in the world, but they are really working hard too. And, you know, having gender studies at their colleges and trying to empower women, just like we are here. So it is happening around the world, and it is happening in the churches. So there's hope.
When you talk with the churches, surely there's a part of our the history of our religion where men are supposed to rise above that too. I mean, it doesn't allow them, biblical teachings don't allow them to be violent and abusive. It's only the women that have to live by the biblical teaching that the men don't. Am I making sense?
Well, unfortunately, Susan, when I was in seminary and in Old Testament class and reading, or the history of Christianity, and reading books written by the Christian fathers back in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries, their writings were such that even if it wasn't scripturally based, their writings were such that men have the right to beat their women, just like they had the right to beat their slaves. You know, they had the right to do it. That's where that rule of thumb comes from.
And
You
people
know.
think that's God's word.
Yes.
It's the word of those men.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Misinterpretation of the word.
Yeah,
So is the Bible,
Mhm.
the word of men.
right.
And so, you know, we have to counter that thinking that, no, that is not what God wants. That's what these people wrote.